Hello again. There is a strange and wholly inexplicable belief on the part of many people that slavery was something unknown in Africa until the wicked white Europeans arrived and began capturing people to transport across the Atlantic. This is nonsense, and I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the evidence for slavery in sub-Saharan Africa before white people appeared on the scene. We know that slavery existed across Europe, Asia, North Africa and North America from the earliest times. Whenever a structured society existed, slavery in one form or another was present. In the Balkans and Peloponnesian Peninsula, to give one example, only one nation did not hold with slavery in ancient times. This was Macedonia, and their rejection of this universal custom is so unusual that it is invariably the object of remark when the history of Macedonia is being discussed. From this perspective, it would have been remarkable if there had been no tradition of slavery in at least some parts of Africa before we find written references to it. There is, though, more definite evidence than this. In 1938, a man named Azara Nosi was digging a cistern on his property in that part of Nigeria in which members of the Igbo tribe live. He unearthed some very fine bronze artefacts which had been made using the cera perdu, or lost wax method of casting. 20 years later, between 1959 and 1960, an archaeological expedition uncovered more bronze items and also the tomb of an important individual who had been buried with great ceremony. He had been interred in a wooden room constructed below ground and then covered with earth. This man had a brass crown on his head and he was holding a whisk in his hand, symbol of office. There were a lot of grave goods accompanying him, ceremonial bronzeware and 100,000 glass and carnelian beads. Carnelian, by the way, is a semi-precious stone, much valued today by devotees of crystal healing. Above the tomb of the person who was presumably a leader of the tribe, or perhaps head of a religion, were found the remains of 5 people who had probably been sacrificed as part of the funerary rites. In many cultures across the world, it was the custom to kill slaves and bury them at the same time as a ruler, so that they could serve the dead man in the next life. The natural assumption is that these 5 individuals were part of this type of ceremony, and this, by extension, suggests the existence of slavery at the time of the burial. Carbon dating has given the 9th century as the time when these 5 individuals died, which predates European contact with that part of Africa by some 500 years. It has also been speculated that the presence of those many thousands of glass and carnelian beads, which were not made locally, indicates that they were obtained through trade for slaves, ivory or spices. The tomb in Nigeria is not the only reason to suppose that slavery was customary in West Africa before Europeans became involved in the slave trade. There is also mention by Muslim writers of what was seen in sub-Saharan Africa in the 14th century. In 1351, a Berber scholar and explorer from Tangier set off across the Sahara from the Mediterranean coast of Morocco. Ibn Battuta had already travelled extensively in Asia and the Middle East, and now he wished to see what lay south of his own homeland in the largely uncharted country of West Africa. After crossing the Sahara in a camel caravan, Ibn Battuta arrived at Tagaza. This is now in the north of the modern-day country of Mali. Slabs of rock salt were mined here at the time that Ibn Battuta visited the town, and the heavy work was undertaken by slaves from the Masufa tribe. After spending some time in Tagaza, the caravan moved south again, eventually reaching the capital of the Empire of Mali, which lay on the banks of the river Niger. This was a Muslim realm ruled by a black African sultan. Slaves were so common that Ibn Battuta was even given one as a present. After looking at other districts of West Africa, Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco, travelling with a caravan which was transporting 600 female slaves north across the Sahara. How come that most people in the Western world are unaware of all this? There's a common and horribly patronising myth about Africa. Although few people ever put the matter into words or follow their ideas to a logical conclusion, an awful lot of white people in Europe and America hold views about pre-colonial Africa which owe a good deal to the 18th century concept of the noble savage. There was in the 17th and 18th centuries a tendency to romanticise those from cultures other than that of Europe. This was done with Native Americans and Africans in particular. The idea was that people who lived in unsophisticated and primitive societies were in some vague sense more natural, and that they were free of the vices which were thought to be a product of civilization at that time. Greed and envy, for instance, were considered to be caused by modern life, and it was thought that in an African or Native American village everybody would share what they had and nobody would be rich or poor. Such people were believed by some to be more natural than those who lived in great cities and were constantly trying to exploit others and become wealthy. This led to the idea of the noble savage, someone untainted by all the bad aspects of modern civilization. Alexander Pope wrote a poem in the early 18th century which summed up the distorted view about the difference between so-called savages and those who lived in civilized lands. Lo, the poor Indian, whose untutored mind sees God in clouds or hears him in the wind. His soul proud science never taught to stray far as the solar walk or Milky Way, yet simple nature to his hope has given behind the cloud-top hill an humbler heaven. Some safer world in depth of woods embraced, some happier island in the watery waste, where slaves once more their native land behold. No fiends torment, no Christians thirst for gold. To be content his natural desire, he asks no angel's wing, no seraph's fire, but thinks, admitted to that equal sky, his faithful dog shall bear him company. It is a pleasing vision of a simple man who is more in touch with nature and God than white Europeans. He has no thirst for gold and is happy simply to be. This mentality is still going strong today. Many people in the West believe that the native inhabitants of both North and South America lived a peaceful life, attuned with the natural world, and that they respected the land in the style of a modern climate change activist. Hand in hand with such ideas goes the traditional view of the noble savage, that before the coming of Europeans to Africa or the Americas, life was simpler and free of many of the less desirable character traits which we see in industrialised countries. These were people free of the mad obsession with acquiring consumer goods or piling up money in banks. Their lives were uncomplicated and gentler than those of us involved in the modern world, and we could learn from examining such people and perhaps adopting their philosophical outlook on life. This fantasy touches upon our flawed perception of slavery and the slave trade. Captivated as we are by the thought of the pastoral and thoroughly natural life led by all those folk in Africa before the Europeans came along and spoiled it all, we cannot quite bring ourselves to believe that some black Africans were every bit as keen on keeping, buying and selling black slaves as any of those men whose statues have been pulled down in Britain and the United States. Better by far to pile all the blame for such a detestable trade on the avarice and cupidity of British and American businessmen.